Okay, guys, so last segment we talked about the jurisdiction and function of law enforcement in the context of um, sanctuary cities, for example. And we looked at the duties and responsibilities for each level, the federal, state, and local. And so now we're going to just talk about the courts for just a few minutes. Okay, now state and local courts, much like state and local law enforcement, in order to be effective, uh, they're going to need the and victims to come forward to testify. Um, and local and state courts need to be a safe place where these witnesses and victims, especially the undocumented uh, victims or witnesses, need to have a sense that they'll be safe while they're there taking care of judicial business. And that's, again, one of the arguments for sanctuary cities and sanctuary states is we need these individuals, these undocumented immigrants, to come forward and to become, again, witnesses or if victims to testify about circumstances that would happen. Okay. Now, federal courts, again, deal with immigration issues because federal law covers immigration. And so we have federal immigration courts, and they hear the immigration cases. But in the case that you looked at here regarding Texas and Senate Bill number 4, what happened in Texas was that the sanctuary cities sued the state of Texas in federal court. And they were able to sue the state of Texas in federal court because they allege a federal violation. In other words, the law, as they perceived it, had some flaws to it, and specifically, they allege that the um, Texas law, Senate Bill 4, um, violated the First and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which we've been reading about under the Bill of Rights. Okay, um, we're not going to get into the specifics as to those constitutional issues, but just know that in order for a claim to arise in federal court, a party, whether it's local government or whatever, has to make sure that the legal action is a violation of federal law, right, in order to get to federal courts. So in this particular case, it was heard in federal district court and then ultimately went to the Fifth Circuit, which is the federal circuit that encompasses the state of Texas and some others. So remember, we went back and you learned about um, the federal circuit courts of appeals, and you realize that the states are divided into circuits. And so the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals is the proper venue for the appeal by the members of the specific cities that were challenging that federal law or that state law on the responsibilities of local law enforcement. Now, the issue here is Senate Bill 4, as written, allows local law enforcement officers to question the immigration status of people they detain or arrest and punishes local government department heads and elected officials who don't cooperate with federal immigration detainers. Requests by agents to turn over immigrants subject to possible deportation in the form of jail time and penalties that exceed $25,000. So there's specific criteria there. And again, one of those is jail time, and the other one is on penalties that are significant. All right. So you're typically not going to have an ICE detainer for someone that had a speeding ticket and is an undocumented immigrant, because quite honestly, with the number of illegal immigrants in this country, they'd be overwhelmed. So they typically will focus in on those undocumented immigrants that they believe pose the greatest threat because of their what they've been arrested for or their criminal history or whatever the case may be. Okay, so that's how the courts get involved in this. State and local courts need undocumented immigrants as victims and witnesses to come forward so they can charge people with serious crimes and get them off the streets. Federal government is a proper venue for immigration cases, as well as appeals from state and local courts, especially those that involve constitutional violation, such as violation of the U.S. Constitution, or something violates federal law. Focus is public safety by investigating and arresting offenders. The idea of jurisdiction, again, immigration is a federal crime, so that's one of the issues and arguments here regarding sanctuary cities is we don't want local law enforcement enforcing federal law. That's not their duties and responsibilities, and that's not what we want them to do. So what the courts do, federal courts, state courts, so we already talked about this pretty much. Again, immigration is handled by the federal level. State courts handle state violations and state constitutional issues. Jurisdictional issues, again, federal and state. The unique thing about federal law enforcement is if we're talking about federal law enforcement obviously has jurisdiction throughout the country, whereas state law enforcement is limited to the boundaries of your state. So as a police officer, for example, in California, I have police officer powers within the state of California. But if I went to Nevada for the weekend, I did not have police powers in the state of Nevada. All right, so when we're talking about jurisdictional issues, all right, so certain crimes are state, certain crimes are federal, and that's how we establish part of our jurisdiction. How do they function together? Legal is associated with sanctuary cities and states, use of federal courts, the Texas article. In terms of how we function together as a law enforcement and the courts, remember that the courts, in terms of the prosecution and bringing forward charges, is part of the DA's responsibilities, and they're part of the court system. So they too need to have these viable victims and witnesses come forward as a means to seek an end to whatever this criminal case might be. In terms of one dysfunction or challenge area, you can look at some jurisdictional issues, impact on criminal cases, which rise to jurisdiction, discretion, confusion. Let's say, for example, that you do have a victim or a witness that's undocumented that needs to be in court to give testimony on a case. And one of the challenges might be if that person were to have been arrested, for example, by federal agents for one reason or another. Let's say it was because of an ICE detainer or an immigration detainer. That clearly would have an impact on the ability of the local courts and state courts to function properly, because they need those witnesses and victims to come forward. Otherwise, it's going to impact the criminal case against the person that assaulted them, robbed them, or whatever the case might be. Okay, so there's always that potential when you're dealing with, there's always that potential when dealing with any victim or witness. But it becomes even more challenging when you're dealing with undocumented immigrants as your victims and witnesses, because you really need to make sure that those folks show up to court, give testimony, and feel comfortable coming to court and giving that testimony. And that's where some of the challenges lie. And again, I experienced those back in the 1980s. So it isn't anything new that we do in law enforcement. Immigration and crime, the migration of foreigners to the U.S. without legal authority. This population includes those who overstayed their authorized period of time as a U.S. visitor, tourist, business person. The only thing I really want to talk about here is the number of illegal immigrants, which is 11 million. So that's a considerable amount of people in the country here that comes in contact with law enforcement. And so managing that group in terms of trying to make them feel at ease, let them understand what their rights are, those are the challenges we face, okay? Many come from countries where police are viewed differently, the courts are viewed differently than they are here. And so trying to build that trust is really essential if we're going to have an efficient and effective criminal justice system. And so therein lies part of the problem. The other thing is that most of those 11 million people are located in specific states, California, Texas, New York, I think New Jersey. The textbook highlights those. So it's just important to understand that some of these issues with immigration and crime and the criminal justice system impact some states more than others. So your state may not have the issue with developing sanctuary cities or having sanctuary states where you live. but others might, just because, again, they're not proportioned equally among the 50 states. Again, the impact of immigration on crime and society. Again, we don't have the exact numbers, and probably never will have the exact numbers, because that's some of the data we don't normally keep. We don't normally keep, is your victim an undocumented immigrant or not? We don't keep that type of information. So it's going to be hard to keep track of some of that information. And then again, immigration and the role of law enforcement agencies. Many state and local police agencies seek to limit their involvement in immigration enforcement activities. Training programs have been created to train officers in areas relevant to immigration in more way than one. It's interesting that law enforcement training has become more complex, because as society becomes more diverse, we're dealing with different cultures, different beliefs, and so as a law enforcement officer, especially at the local level, you need to understand what those are as you interview people, as you try to build and maintain that level of trust within the community. Okay, so I'm just going to pause here for a second, and then I just want to call up the grading rubric for this week. So hang on for just a second, fellas. Thanks. Okay, so here's the assignment template that we're going to be using for this week. And so there's a couple things you're going to do. You're going to describe how the U.S. law enforcement and court system functions together. And we talked about that, okay? We talked about the importance of them working together in the context of undocumented immigrants, in the context of ensuring that we can get our victims and witnesses to come to court, to trust the system, to not be afraid of the criminal justice system, and understand the duties and responsibilities of local authorities versus federal authorities in the context of immigration. Okay. We also showed by reading the article how this whole immigration process can lead to appeals, and so in the example we cited, cities within the state of Texas sued the state of Texas in federal court because that's how the process worked, because the cities in the state of Texas that had promoted sanctuary cities and were against the passage of SB 4 argued that it was unconstitutional, violated U.S. Constitution, so that's how we got into federal court. Include at least one dysfunction or challenge area. So think about some of the challenges associated with law enforcement and the courts working together. Again, I sort of gave you an example of if we have a victim or a witness who somehow ends up as part of being arrested by ICE, and now that person can't attend court. That can cause a problem, because maybe that person is a key witness to something that we need done. So sometimes our goals and our roles and our objectives aren't always the same. The federal authorities have their objectives, and local or state authorities, we have our objectives, and sometimes those are not the same. There's some follow-up questions here for you to consider. In what ways do law enforcement and the courts work together throughout the process in the article? So in the article, we're talking about the fact that, remember, local government sued the state in federal court, and so that's how this all works together. What jurisdiction do the court systems have? So again, remember that federal courts has to be a violation of federal law or U.S. Constitution. State courts has to be a violation of state law or state constitutions. And then describe how the court system functioned in order to arrive at the decision in this case. So obviously there had to be arguments on both sides, and looking at the constitutionality of this law, AB 4. So take a look at the article, read the article, take a look at the short video which outlines the federal authorities. You hang out with ICE for an evening. It's like cops on TV. Okay. So anyhow, take your time on this. Don't get nutted up over it. It's a lot easier than it sounds. If you have any questions, let me know.